All right. So, yeah, if the host can't unmute himself, then we've really got some serious problems. But thanks for everybody that joined us for the earlier sessions today. Hope you learned a lot. I know I did. And one of the things that's exciting is that we've got even more insights to come. So it's going to be a great next two sessions. And because this next one really focuses on the issue of time, it fits to our theme here of perform under pressure, because so much of the pressure we feel is about time. In fact, like right now, you're like, do I have time to watch this? Right now, Oliver Burkeman I once had a column that said, "This column will change your life." I think this interview is going to change your life. That's a major promise here. So let me bring on Oliver, and then we'll see if we can deliver on that. Oliver, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you? It's good to be here.
Glad to have you. You know, listen, we had Danny Meyer, one of the great restaurateurs of the world.
Yeah.
We had one of the top chefs in the world, Chad Williams. We're all hungry here. Are you a good chef? What do you cook well?
No, I compliment this gathering today perfectly because I'm a terrible chef. And you know, it's I wouldn't want to tread on their toes in any way whatsoever.
Excellent. Well, let's get right to the question of 4,000 weeks. The book that you've written that's gotten a lot of attention, Time Management for Mortals. This is my very underlined copy here, and I will tell you that in the sense that you kind of try to turn that word time management on its head, because we sort of feel oppressed by it. But I think you're trying to liberate us. Is that what you're trying to do?
I really hope so. You know, I gave it this title, 4,000 weeks, which is the approximate average lifespan in the developed world. I rounded it down to get to that sort of nice headline figure. And I accept what some people have said, that that's kind of a scary thing to do, like to give a book this kind of scary title. But I hope that the argument that I make in it, and hopefully get some of that today, absolutely is to do with reducing the way that pressure of time burdens us, in order to free us up to, you know, to be empowered to do things, because we're not sort of staggering under this burden of our finite time.
Well, we're going to get into some of the nitty gritty here, but I found the book enlightening, as did many others. 4,000 weeks is one way to do it. I don't feel this as oppressive, but I actually, in my daily notebook, I wrote down the day number that I've been alive.
Oh,
so
wow.
Today is 21,771 on the count. So I don't know where that falls in the 4,000 weeks, but it's too far close to the end. and there's something that you say about life in general, which is that it's sort of like just unfairly short. So kick us off here about just sort of your philosophy of time.
I guess, yeah, I'm starting from this fact that, to me, the really important thing here is that it is finite, right? Obviously, nobody knows how many weeks each of us is going to get. Tragically, many people will get less than 4,000. Many people will get more than 4,000 weeks. So it's nothing to do with the number. It's the fact that it is finite and everything that follows from that. And I guess we can get into the details, but the sort of broad idea I'm trying to get at here is that I think we spend a lot of time putting a lot of effort into sort of not thinking about the ramifications of having finite time. Indeed, into actually sort of actively trying to deny them to ourselves. And I think a lot of the problems we run into with time, when it comes to certain kinds of really sort of toxic busyness, procrastination, feeling scattered, all the things that are problems for us today, it's really because we haven't taken full account of what it means to be finite, and all the sort of consequences of this, like the fact that there will always be more things that matter than you will have a chance to do, that you will never feel like you have the control over the future that you feel that you want. Really sort of bringing people into this mindset of how finite we are, not as a reason to despair and give up and not do anything, but precisely so that we can stop fighting this kind of futile battle to try to get on top of everything, and instead make really sort of wise, conscious decisions about what we do, and sort of give ourselves permission not to be superhuman, precisely so that we can be the most effective humans that we can be.
Wise and conscious. Good words. Now, to the theme of our episode here today on performing under pressure. Pressure, we can think of it in a negative context, but what's the old phrase? No pressure, no diamonds.
Mm.
What role does pressure have in a positive way around how we think about time?
Well, it's interesting. I was thinking deeply about this theme of yours, and I suppose that there are kind of two nuances to
Mhm.
the idea of pressure of time. There's two different connotations that it has. One is obviously, the idea of being an ER doctor, or being a chef, being somebody in a kind of an athlete, someone in a very, very intense moment where
Mhm.
you have to do the thing very, very quickly. And then there is this notion, this much more sort of everyday notion of time pressure, which is just like overwhelm, basically, right? It's just like too many things that we feel that there is more that we have to do in the time we have than that we can do. Which, by the way, is a very strange notion if you start thinking about it. The idea that you must do more than you can do. It gets very sort of incoherent very quickly. And I think that the positive sense that we're talking about here, that sort of brings these two perspectives together for me, is the
Mhm.
idea that when you really take on board what it means to be finite, when you really take on board that you're only going to ever get to act on a very small proportion of all the things you could in principle do, when you feel the pressure of time in that sense, like across a lifespan, it's actually, yeah, I think it's really positive and really liberating and really motivating, because it enables you to say, look, okay, the battle of trying to do all of these things is like, that battle is lost. And precisely because that battle is lost, that means that I can sort of use the fact of my finitude to really throw myself into the things that I do, right? If the pressure of time is telling you I've got to try to get through 1,000 things by the end of the day, that's a kind of the pressure of time as a distraction.
Mhm.
If it's telling you I just get to be here for a little while, and a few of these choices that I make are going to make a difference to me, to other people, to the world, then I think you really step into this idea that I slightly facetiously in the book call the joy of missing out. The idea that every choice we make about how to use an hour of our time or a day or
Mhm.
a year has its value precisely because we had to turn down 1,000 other things, to
Yeah,
spend it
true enough.
in that way.
Well, let's talk. I'm trying to think of the different kinds of folks that are joining us today or who will watch this later. We have a lot of people. Obviously, they come to admire leadership for insights around leadership, and we think that everyone is a leader in some regard. We're all making people or situations better or worse, and hopefully, we become better at making them better. And so, whether we're advising, top, corporate leaders or nonprofit leaders, or we have athletic coaches and we have school teachers and we have parents and all of those things, everybody in a way is trying to kind of improve themselves in their relationship to their effectiveness in all of this. So people are coming to this with a lot of different, sets of the reasons that they're looking for insights here today. So you have taken a bit of a journey yourself in trying to kind of, you've written a lot in your work as a journalist on happiness, on meaning, and now time, and really your approach to time is a larger philosophy sort of endeavor. So what was the thing that made you write this book? Was there a crisis moment for you where you just kind of hit a wall?
In a sense, there was. I mean, I wrote this column that you mentioned in your introduction for in the UK for the Guardian weekend magazine for years, where I was one among many things, sort of experimenting with productivity techniques, with life
Mhm.
philosophies and ways of organizing life. And the interesting thing that happens if you do that as a job is that you get to test out many more than probably most other people may have the
Sure.
opportunity to do, and that's very useful because once you've tried 100 of them and none of them have brought you this sort of perfect sense of peace of
Right.
mind or perfect sense of control, that's when you begin to ask, whether you're asking the right question here. And I think that's when things get really interesting. And I did sort of come to realize that I had spent a lot of my life seeking to use my time as well as I could, seeking to be as efficient as I could getting busier and more stressed as a result of that, which we can talk about if you want, and constantly postponing like the real meaning of life into the future, which is a very widespread thing among, I think, driven people, among people who are ambitious. There's this sense that like, no, the real thing is always going to come when I've sorted this out, when I've built the company to this stage, when I've received this promotion. We come up with all these milestones. So yeah, I was getting in a bit of a crisis about that. I write also, I won't go into it in detail unless you want me to, but I write also in the book about a moment sitting on a park bench in Prospect Park in Brooklyn when I was sort of desperately trying to figure out how I would use all the time management techniques I knew to get through a really unusually unpleasantly busy week of deadlines, and just being hit by the thought like, oh, it's impossible. Oh, I'm trying to do something impossible. And finding that to be such a huge liberation. And again, not a liberation that led to me just sitting on the park bench all day doing nothing, a liberation that enabled me to really do some meaningful work because I wasn't any longer attempting to be all things to all people and stake my self-worth on the idea of doing everything. I think that's an important part of this.
Or doing the thing that literally is impossible. So we often do think about time and our approach to time in terms of these kind of techniques, and you apparently tried all of them. So before we come back to the big picture, talk us through some of those things, because we're all looking and saying, all right, how do I set priority, and how do I do I use time blocking, or do I use the Pomodoro technique, or do I do the top 3 items and nothing else? Does any of that work, or did any of it stick for you? How do you go about your daily life now?
Sure. I love this topic. I mean, I think the really important thing, and I will get to some specifics, but the really important thing is the spirit in which you come to these techniques, right? There are hundreds of productivity techniques, and lots of them are fine as a way of organizing your day, motivating yourself to work, dividing up your day in a sensible way. What none of them will do is like save you. That's the thing I'm always trying to get at, right? None of them are going to get you into the position where you don't have to make tough choices with your time, where you don't have to learn how to say no, even to things that would be good things to do, where you don't have to be conscious about how you're apportioning your finite time. If you get through that illusion, the Pomodoro technique is a perfectly, this idea of dividing your work into 25-minute chunks with 5-minute breaks, for example, is a great idea. All sorts of other methods can be great, as long as you sort of come at them in a deeply kind of down to earth way. A whole set of techniques that I've found the most useful for me and that I do continue to use have to do with sort of visualizing my capacities to work. I do some work in sort of larger teams, but I'm a very solitary person in general as a book writer. And it really helps me to use methods like the idea of the Kanban board, which I'm sure many people will be familiar with. There's a related version of, I feel like I don't want to go into a 20-minute disquisition about a specific way of organizing your to-do list, but I will if you want. But the point is about all these ways that seem to work for me, they sort of they make clear and visual and unignorable the sort of 50 projects that I may have technically on my plate at any one time. And then they say, okay, from this 50, what are the 2 that you're going to be working on right now before you bring any more from the sort of the backlog? There's a great book called Personal Kanban, which does that, which sort of adapts the idea of the Kanban to individual knowledge work. Any method that sort of takes this fact, which is that we are always choosing in every minute what to do and ignoring 1,000 things to focus on one, and makes that vivid to you so that you have to choose, really.
Well, and obviously we're living in a time of sort of, I want to say unprecedented, but maybe it's not. Maybe things were really frenetic in ways we don't understand when we were running from creatures that wanted to eat us, and we got back to our cave as fast as we possibly could. but we have, we all feel beset. And one of the things that you pointed out, it's one of the main things I kind of come back to in my own mind from the book, just from time to time, is when we actually get to that point where we're the person who really has finally mastered this, like we're getting things done and we're signing off on this, and we've accomplished all of those things on our list. Well, then what we do in organizations and in society now is we crush you with more. Right.
Yeah.
We just,
right.
oh, hey, she's really effective. Well, let's just keep piling until we break her.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So you really are on the, if your approach is wrong, if your philosophy is wrong, you're in a losing race from the beginning.
Right. And I call this, in the book, I call this the efficiency trap, but it goes
Mhm.
by various different names. Some
Yeah.
people here with us today may be familiar with Parkinson's law, right? There's all these different ways of talking about it. The basic principle is, if you feel like you've got too much to do, or that there's more that you want to do than you're managing to do, and your main approach to that is to make yourself or your organization, I think, more efficient so that you can process more tasks in less time, if that's all you do, then all else being equal, the effect of this is going to be that you end up busier with more stuff to do. And on balance, I think you can make the case more lower quality stuff to do, more stuff that isn't at the center of your right. mission. Classic example of this for anyone is email, right? If you get really, really good at answering email at a quick tempo, the result is that you get a lot more email, because you reply
Right.
to people and they reply to your replies, and you have to reply to their reply. And, you're not supposed to say this, but the fact is that if you ever go through a period of being quite unresponsive on email, it can be quite useful. Like, certain people email you about some crisis they're worried about, and by the time you get to the email, the crisis never materialized and everyone's moved on. I'm not really recommending being bad at email, but it's sort of educational to see
Sure
what happens to people who really try to be very virtuous about email. They find, as the saying goes, that the reward for good time management is more work. And so, yeah, there's nothing wrong with making certain efficiency savings around the edge, but I think that any serious approach to time management has to focus on, the tough choices. What am I not going to do? What limits am I going to put around how I spend my time, rather than what's a more efficient way to get through everything?
Yeah. So you've referenced a few things already in personal Kanban and others. So as we're like all trying to kind of find some way that is sort of I think in your interview with Peter Attia, he was saying, I'm looking for this unified field theory. I've read Oliver's book, and I read Arthur Brooks's book, and this one and that one. I'm trying to pull all these things together. There's got to be some way. But it sounds like in some ways you're saying there may not be a perfect way. There may be some things that work particular for individuals in certain circumstances. But the guiding principles that are through the particular techniques are the things I think you've tried to emphasize. Are there, and you phrase this in terms of like you as a writer, and you're kind of working individually. It's not like you've got, an organization of 40,000 people accountable for your decision as the CEO, and you've got, division managers coming to you for big decisions. But I'm sure people like that. I'm sure you've thought and put yourself in their shoes. Are there good models that you see in the world where you say, here's somebody who is really effective at a very high level, and they seem to have the right approach and philosophy of time? Sometimes it's kind of hard to find those folks.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there are people in sort of known to me and in my life who I certainly admire in this respect. And some of those are in situations where they have quite a few. They're working in sort of larger organizations. And, I do work with small team most of the time. So it's not completely alien to me in a personal way. And when I think about those people, I mean, I think this should be something I'm sure that is close to your heart. A lot of this is inner work, right? So in some sense, it is not about methods of managing other people. It's a transformation that I think these people have gone through, or maybe even in some cases never needed to go through in the first place, because they were born with it. Inside yourself, that has to do with a real appreciation of the fact that, like, our capacities, our energy, our time is finite. And this means that you have to be bold enough to actually put the time into the things that matter the most, which really means being able to manage the anxiety of not doing the other things. and of allowing, I think you do see this quite often in sort of startup contexts where people have this amazing willingness in successful cases to leave almost all sort of nice to have developments just indefinitely from being done, because they know that there's a couple of things that are must-haves, and at that point there's only 3 of them, in the organization. I think people go wrong. Organizations often go wrong when the fact that they have more capacity fools them into thinking that they have effectively infinite capacity. So I always come back to this idea. I don't claim to be an expert on sort of management approaches, but I do think that you find that in every area of life, this starts with modeling something, right? It starts with like the idea that if it starts with having an approach to email that embodies what you want other people to enact. It starts with being willing to say, if you want your team to focus on this key priority, to be willing to have the conversation about what they're not going to be focusing on for that same period of time, and sort of trusting that this way of navigating, which involves sort of letting go of things as well as bearing down hard on a few of them, is gonna get you there. I think a huge amount goes wrong in sort of every area of organizational and other life through the fact that what some leaders are actually doing is trying to make the feelings of uncertainty go away rather than actually progress the core work forward, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, indeed. And we certainly want to be looking for models, and we can maybe talk about a few, but there's a bit of a trap there too. And I was just thinking as we were talking, it's like you think about somebody, just using Cal Newport as an example. I might say, gosh, I just can't quite get over the hump of really getting control. Nobody can do it. It's impossible. And then you're like, wait, this guy is really time blocking his way to an enormous number of deep work hours. And he's also doing podcasts, and he's also publishing 9 peer-reviewed papers a year. And he's taking, long vacations to Maine, and he's done with his work by 5:30 and he goes to the gym, and you're like, well, screw that guy, right? So we certainly can feel defeated when we see people that do seem to have it together, right? Now, I think Cal would say this is achievable. You can do this, and so I think that's the question here, which is, can we get to a place where we're taking wisdom from a Cal Newport, from an Arthur Brooks, from you, to say, no, we can get to a way where we feel like we are doing deep and meaningful work in the world, and we're not crushing our personal lives, and we're having time to revive and refresh ourselves, and yet still make a significant difference in the kind of work we're trying to do to contribute to others.
Yeah, absolutely. And you raised such a good point about the way that we take figures offering advice, offering inspiration, and sort of turn them, not at their request, usually, into kind of deities who sort of embody everything we want to be. I'm a huge admirer of Cal's work. And at the same time, I think it is absolutely okay to say, to know one's personality. And one thing I know, I think I'm planning to have a discussion with Cal about this, a recorded discussion before too long. So I'm really looking forward to this, because I think we'll agree and disagree in interesting ways. But, one thing I've found about myself is that an overly rigid approach to time boxing, time blocking for me, he would say time blocking doesn't have to be rigid. I get it. But to me, that is sort of feels stifling and oppressive in a way that is detrimental to my work. I'm actually moving further away in my own work from a control-based ideas to sort of intuitive ideas, not all the way, because you need some shape to what you're doing. But so, I think that's an excellent place where the right way to relate to somebody who's saying something interesting and inspiring and making a success of it in their own lives is to take it as, to return to the chef analogy, take these as ingredients for making your own dish, right? To not say, to not try to embody exactly what another person is doing, but to have the sort of self authority to say, like, that's great, I'm going to use that, and that other thing is great, and I'm going to use that, and put it together. And sorry if I just go on it, but this is sort of, I think this is important, that there is no final situation here. There's no meta system. There's no there's no set of rules that you're going to discover, and from then on, like, you don't have to really live life because the rules can live life for you, right? And one of the biggest liberations for me was seeing that, yeah, I'm always going to be tweaking my approach to these things, because I'm going to be changing, I hope, as I continue to go through life. And I don't want to have some notion that says I'm doing something wrong because I'm evolving, because I had this system that was supposed to be the only system that was going to work for me. So I'm
Yeah.
always like, I'm a magpie. I'm taking these things from everywhere and using them if they're useful, and then discarding them if they're not.
Yeah. So, and let me just note, by the way, that we can get people to put those questions into the Q&A. It's a little harder for me to look at the chat right now, but if you get them in the Q&A, I can sort them out and pull them up to the front. But let me ask you, in terms of you say you're kind of moving away from this idea of rigidity towards a more I don't know if you said the word intuitive, but in terms, you're even visualizing the way that you're looking at time. To our theme of performing under pressure, you could imagine that people that try to really say, all right, I've got to get my list done, I've got to get this set up here, I've got to get my chart over here, I've got to get my time blocked and my Newport, time blocking calendar, that when the crisis moment hits, like when you're really in that moment where it's all falling apart, maybe you fall apart more. But maybe that also gives you the foundation to be prepared to not fall apart. What have you found in terms of that? When you see those moments where leaders or individuals are really in moments of crisis, what about time seems to best support them in those moments?
I think it's undoubtedly true that having your sort of your informational and your organizational systems in place can only help, right? So when I talk about moving away from rigidity, I'm talking about rigidity in terms of the felt need to have the day unfold in a specific way. I'm not talking about being well organized in terms of, the materials that are needed for working on projects, for the sort of the support networks that are needed to be able to call on people to do different roles. That stuff, I think, again, rigid is probably the wrong word, but well organized is that's a great base. I guess you're talking about crisis in the sense of things going wrong and unplanned things happening. But in another sense, if you think about, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was going to unpack it just in this way. At the top of our sessions today, I used an analogy from a writer who was saying, when you can think about where you're trying to go, and we sometimes use sports analogies and others, what's the championship moment? When do they hand you that trophy? And the question being, don't think about that moment. Think about 20 minutes before. Think about that step or stage, because that moment is probably not comfortable, right? The things that precede anything really worthwhile that we've done, the moments right before tend to be a little chaotic. That's where they become a real test of that which we know. Right. In fact, I think, there's a definition of that around that idea that when you move from real mastery to that highest level, it's when you've sort of reintroduced chaos into the picture to see how well can I find and adapt. I think that's what I was trying to point to.
Yeah. And I think, we're sort of, I think a couple of the issues we're maybe skirting around here is, one is sort of flow states, right? And the idea that there is this kind of timeless experience that in some ways we might be shooting for, that somebody at the peak of their powers may be in, but that seems to resist being willed or aimed for, right? You can't really sit down and say, I am now going to enter a flow state. It's to do with a sort of a forgetting. So you need your resort, you need everything set up so that you don't need to be worrying about stuff other than what you're focused on. But then you also need to sort of not be trying to will yourself into the flow state. I think that for me, and this comes again and again in all sorts of different areas, including in my book as well, when I'm writing about time, is a willingness, especially in those moments that you're talking about, to tolerate discomfort, right? To feel discomfort arising, whether it's interpersonal, whether it's to do with the difficulty of something. Believe me, like, writing is full of it all the time, for me anyway. And to sort of be able to feel that discomfort and recognize it and say, like, oh yes, that's discomfort, and not have it dictate your actions in an unhelpful way, not have it cause you to sort of hurry through work that needs to be done slowly, not have it sort of cause you to reach decisions that are not the wisest decisions, but just make the discomfort go away. And then again and again and again, you find people in all sorts of walks of life, testifying to this idea that just being able to hang out with those emotions. I mean, I think this is a topic about emotions that we're talking about ultimately. Yeah. It's therapy. I mean, this is where I have to say I'm not a qualified therapist or anything like that, but it really is being able to feel feelings that we might not welcome and not have them dictate our actions in an attempt to get them to go away fast.
Now, true. We have to sort of learn to kind of, live with that and embrace that in some ways. And sometimes that just becomes normal. I mean, if every day, you got out there and somebody smacked you in the face on the way out the door, that would be uncomfortable. But if it happened, 100 times in a row, after a while, you'd be like, well, I guess this is just what it's like. And you wouldn't like it, but you deal with it. Yeah. But let's talk about priority a little bit, because I think a lot of us feel like if I could just get the values right, if I could just get the big rocks, and we sometimes use the rocks metaphor as lots of people do, going back to Covey's book with the Merrills 35 years ago. Mm-hmm. And whether that's it's a story that I think you've referred to as possibly apocryphal, and maybe it is, although I think in that book they actually cite their colleague who attended a session where he mm-hmm. claimed to have seen this demonstrated. So let's pretend it is, where the idea of, we all know, like, all right, I'm going to put the rocks in, then I'm going to put the pebbles in, then I'm going to put the sand in, then I'm going to put the water in. And if you put the rocks in first, you get your values in first, then you can get a lot in your jar. But if you put the sand in first and the little stuff, it's going to drive out the big thing. You have a key problem with this right. with this metaphor. Why don't you start by explaining your problem with this metaphor?
Yeah, I'm sort of hopefully in a benign way, very rude about this story in my book. The basic problem here is that there is a sort of hidden assumption in the setup, which is that the only the number of rocks are introduced into this demonstration that the organizer knows can fit into the glass jar. I think that the real problem that we have, the fundamental problem, is not that we arrange our activities badly, that we sort of give too much attention to the things that we consider to be irrelevant, sand and pebbles, and insufficient attention to the things that we mm-hmm. care about, the values, the core project. It's that there are too many big rocks, right? It's that there is no natural law that says, just because something really feels to me like it matters, therefore there's enough time to get it done. And so go on, sorry.
Well, no, I was going to say, well, guide us there a little bit, because I think that what we've found, and kind of studying the best leaders that we can find, is they do tend to have some core rocks or priorities, whatever you want to call them. And I know people use rocks in EOS and other places. And we tend to see, you can kind of, maybe you can handle 6 or 7. If you come to me and you've got 18, then you got a problem. Right. But how do we get to those? Because it probably is true that you have 5, 6, 7, maybe 8 big things that you need to touch every day in some way to kind of maintain the person you need to be in the world. But how do you get to that?
Well, I think, I always come back to the perspective shift and the emotional work that's involved. I think that the way you get to that starts with really understanding that the ones that you put aside, the ones that you decide not to work on, are not necessarily inferior. They're not necessarily, it's not necessarily a process, in other words, of going through a list of 20 and figuring out which are the 6 or 8 that really matter and persuading yourself that the others didn't really matter. It's about understanding that it's our sort of situation as humans that there are just going to be 20 things that in some sense really matter. And mm-hmm. so the decision to let go of a whole bunch of them, either forever or just on a seasonal basis, it might be a question of what you're focusing on at this point, is not going to necessarily be a result of figuring out which ones matter more than others. It may be somewhat arbitrary and maybe highly intuitive. And as soon as you get to that stage, it's actually a lot easier to choose some priorities, because you're no longer, you're no longer trying to convince yourself that what you're focused on are the only things that could matter. You're saying, no, for this season of life, this season of an organization's life, it's going to be these ones, and it's not going to be those ones. Not really because the ones that are being let go are secretly much less valuable. I heard somebody phrased it in a way I like, which is just like, it isn't prioritization unless it hurts, right? It's like there's focusing as finite humans in a world of sort of theoretically infinite possibilities. Prioritization means letting go of things that are going to be painful to let go of. And once you accept that, it's kind of okay in a way. It's so just to give, I can give personal examples about how that works for me, but it's all to do with saying, like, okay, the fact that I'm not going to work on that really exciting idea right now is not because it isn't valuable. It's because if I try to work on all of these exciting ideas at once, I will make progress on none of them. And I'd rather make progress on 3 than 0. Yeah.
And maybe that's part of what you pointed to. And one of the questions that's come in is about this, as you kind of go from this sort of control approach to time to more of this and a bit more intuitive approach to mind, which by the way, I'm fine with. I mean, I think there's a lot of literature and a lot of what Ian McGilchrist has been writing around the nature of intuition. And I think we need to restore that balance to kind of how we're thinking about the world, but making that real in the world. And you were saying, well, maybe I can should or shouldn't give an example, but do you have an example? Are there ways that you're kind of using, I don't want to use the word technique, but patterns that kind of move you away from that control standpoint to the more intuitive approach?
There are, and I'm just going to honestly recommend another book by somebody else that made a big impression on me, which is a book called Time Surfing by a Dutch Zen monk called Paul Lumens. And it's a very simple book, and it doesn't even have that many words in it. It's a very Zen feel, but
it seems right.
Right. It helped clarify some thinking that I'd already been sort of doing in a less articulated way, and it's really a question of in his approach and I would say in my unfolding approach as well. It's really a question of a set of principles, right? It isn't necessarily do exactly this technique, organize your day in exactly this way. It's more a question of principles like, do one thing at a time, go through a sort of conscious process of accepting in yourself what that one thing is, and of understanding what completion of it would look like. I'm talking on the level of half-hour tasks, not on the level of, projects over a year or something. Just working in a way that respects the thing that you're doing. One that made a big impression on me, that is also mainly comes from Paul Lumens, is this idea that, do what you can to defend against unwanted interruptions in your work. But once you are interrupted, and if you have a 6-year-old like I do, you're going to be interrupted sometimes, but everyone's going to be interrupted with it. Once you're interrupted, give the interruption your full attention rather than otherwise. And this is an extraordinary thing, right? Because it turns out that if I get a call that I kind of didn't want to get, or somebody comes into the room when I would have rather they didn't, the best way to do right by them and also to get back to what I was doing before is to give that interruption full attention rather than be smeared between the two of them. And this is a very low level sort of day, hour by hour kind of idea, but it does reinforce a kind of a muscle in me. I find that is to do with trusting my intuition, right? It is to do with not deeming it a huge failure when the day in my mind begins to diverge from some very rigid schedule, but sort of having the faith that there's a lovely line from Marcus Aurelius somewhere where he says, like, you worry about the future, but you're perfectly capable of dealing with this moment. So just assume that you're going to have the same resources in your personality in the future to deal with later moments, instead of having to sort of very rigidly control the day. Just sort of trust that in each moment you're going to be able to figure out the next thing that needs doing.
Now, how do you approach kind of creating those moments for the deep work, to use Newport's phrase? I kind of think of, like, a helpful metaphor to me was once I heard Donald Miller, the writer, talk about it's like deep sea diving. If I get hooked up and I'm on my tank and I get all the way down to the bottom, and then you interrupt me, then I got to come all the way back up. I got to repressurize. I got to come out. I got to change the tank. And by the time I get back down, like, I'm out of time. Like, but and I know that's true for me. Like, it takes some time to get into those moments where you maybe are trying to get to flow, where you're actually getting into that, where you do have to kind of set some signals to the world. This is not the time to interrupt me. So even though with a 6-year-old and I have a 9-year-old, I mean, these things happen, but what are the wise and conscious ways and reasonable ways we can go about creating those moments for us to do some of that deep work?
Well, I'll tell you what I do, and again, I am conscious that that the work I do is it's a particular kind of work. It's not going to exactly be reflected in every line of work, but I think deep work is pretty universal among, or the need for deep work is pretty universal among knowledge workers today.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the very simple things I do, it's not rocket science, is that I seek to protect on my calendar from meetings and from other commitments a period of time that is a good hour or two longer than the number of hours of serious writing that I aim to do in a day. So I might protect, if I possibly can, 5, even 6 hours of the day, but really I know that 3 or 4 hours of really real focused writing is as much as I can do, and it's really as much as I need to do if I'm doing it consistently to
create that buffer.
Yeah, right, exactly. So that it's a buffer in terms of you can't reach me, you shouldn't expect to reach me in these times, but it isn't a rule as in I've then got to fill every single minute of that with high quality deep work, because that's a pressure that I don't need.
Yeah. All right, let me get to
some pressures I do need, but that's one I don't.
Yeah. Well, getting into a couple of questions that we had that came in. Krista was saying that when we talked about this trap of efficiency, where we just, the more efficient people are, the more we pile on them, that people do kind of get into that sort of mode where they're trying to be more perfect in their work, and then they are getting more stressed. So her question is, what questions can we ask to reflect on and be aware of in the direction we're heading, and what can we do to get people to be more efficient and use the time gains that we might get from being more efficient in the right way, so that it's not just filling it up with more things on the to-do list?
One of the sort of principles that I do write about in the book and has made a big difference to me, I think I attribute the phrasing to a creativity coach called Jessica Abel, is this idea of paying yourself first with time. Again, I'll talk about it in my day, but I think the principle is easily adaptable. It's just the idea that whether you're talking about organizing a day or planning a week or a quarter, you resist this urge to sort of try to clear the decks, try to deal with all of the possible outstanding little things, so that you will get to, or so you believe, right, this expanse of deeply focused time later on. And instead, you do the stuff that counts the most first. And that might be as simple as the old advice to spend the first hour of the working day working on the most important stuff before you turn to your email. There are all sorts of other ways of kind of implementing it. The point then is, right, you still have to do your email. You still have to, and if you're a hyper efficient emailer, great, but you're doing it in a certain number of fixed hours later in the day, rather than allowing it to colonize the whole of the day. People often think that what they need to do is get rid of all those things that are making them anxious before they can focus. I think the skill we need to learn is to tolerate the anxiety of knowing that all those things are waiting for us, and nonetheless be able to spend an hour or 90 minutes, on something that really matters.
I'm going to be thinking about this idea of tolerating the anxiety and kind of learning to get past that point. Just let kind of float past it a little bit. Let time pass, as has been said. and I know this idea of paying yourself first. I know where I feel it, which is I tend to get through most of the things I need to get done in the day. And including I spend a lot of time reading with my 9-year-old in the evening. We're in the gym a lot at night, but I always have a target to read a certain amount, in books that I'm reading in a day. And I almost never, that's the thing that gets chopped, and it shouldn't. It's actually the most important thing. No matter where I seem to put that on the schedule, and that bastard Cal Newport's reading 50 books a year, right? And you're like, goodness gracious, like I'm doing my best here. And yet paying yourself first with that. If I read early in the morning, and I get really into the book, and then I'm not getting on to the other work to be done.
Yeah.
So then you just start beating yourself up, and nobody wins. I'm not asking you to solve my problem right there. But when we look at this, I realize, even to what Krista's saying and what Marlo is saying here, what strategies can leaders use in time pressure situations to get their teams to stay calm or to stay focused? More and more, I would imagine, in the world in which we live, a leader's job is not only keeping their own priorities and focus in order, but it's helping leaders to guide their teams, right? Because I think they're probably looking at their teams and they're seeing wildly divergent abilities to deal with time and priority in an effective and a healthy way. Have you spent much time thinking about that in terms of how leaders can help other people that they're working with get better at how they think about time?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I think that a lot of it does start with just the willingness on the part of the leader to have the conversation, right? To be open to, when we're talking about prioritization and focus, we're talking about all the things we're not going to have a chance to do, as well as the things that matter the most. You don't want to be contributing to a workplace culture where people feel that they can't acknowledge that if that there is too much to do, because they shouldn't have too much to do. One of the things I'm always returning to in the book is like, no, the supply of things to do is effectively infinite. So nobody should, from the get-go, feel bad that they can't get through that supply. People can handle it more or less competently, but this idea that there's going to be stuff that doesn't get done, I think that's really important.
Sophie asking, go ahead. No, go ahead.
And I was just going to say, in terms of specific methodologies, one comes back again and again and again past all these complicated systems for handling workflows, back to the idea that what this comes down to is selecting a single task or a single project, making it hugely visible in an office setting or in a digital equivalence, and understanding what completion would be, making it a sort of relatively near-term kind of completion, so that there's a win to be had, and just doing it. There's a guy on YouTube called Chris DeLeon, whose work I've admired in the past, who literally says, like, you get yourself a mini whiteboard. You write down on the whiteboard the one thing that you're going to do and complete over the next somewhere between 30 and 50 minutes. You put it on the desk in front of you and you do it. And it's kind of stupid, but we are, in a very fundamental way, as animals. So I don't think we should be ashamed to adopt those kinds of single tasking aids if they help us.
Yeah, I could see myself having a really continual argument with that whiteboard as it sits there looking at me. Right. Yeah. So Sophie asking, how do you think attitudes around time and time management has changed or shifted among different generations? What are you seeing now in younger folks in the workforce and how they think about time, as opposed to other older generations? My generation, I'll put myself there.
Yeah, shall I pretend to be like much younger than you or something? I don't think I am. I think, from what I see, again, yes, it's not me, but I think there's sort of two dynamics that are very obvious, and one obviously comes from being completely online all the time in some way. That sense of all the challenges that poses in terms of distraction and sort of living in another mental place. I think those challenges are not easier for younger people, just because they are less, I think they're felt as more of a problem by people like me, right? Because I can remember the time before them. I think the other thing that's really interesting, though, and that is very sort of, in certain ways, very hopeful and positive, is is a real sort of sense of the preciousness of time and the importance of rest, and an unwillingness to just let tasks endlessly colonize every corner of space. I know this for some managers is going to make itself felt as a sort of reluctance on the part of younger people to work as hard as one might feel they should, or something like that. And of course, you see the sort of anti-work movement. There's also, it goes to extremes, absolutely. But there is, I think, an awareness of finitude that has come from, it's come from this culture in which people are experiencing some of the symptoms of burnout in their 20s or their 30s, which would never used to be the case when that sort of concept was invented. I think that, the life has got so accelerated, the demands have got so great, that actually people are reaching a useful kind of crisis sooner in their lives and seeing like, well, hang on, this is not a sustainable way to spend the next 4 decades of my working life. And while as I say, I think that can curdle into a sort of disengagement. Ultimately, really, the kernel of that, the seed of that, is a good thing. That is an awareness of how precious time is, and that just filling it with thousands more emails is not the right way to make use of it.
Let me ask you the question this way, in a way that I once, many decades ago, posed it to the management guru of the 70s and 80s, Edwards Deming. What is the purpose of work?
I mean, that's such a great question. I'm under time pressure to come up with an answer.
Deming had a one-word answer. I'm not putting the pressure on. I'll say that. Let me hear your answer, and then I'll tell you what he said. Am I being unfair?
I think that the purpose of everything we do in the world, ultimately, and therefore ultimately has to be the purpose of work as well, is to be and to feel and to spread the feeling of being fully alive. It is to show up ourselves and help other people show up for this incredibly brief span of time that we have. And I think that in one way or another, when any work is meaningful, you can find the way in which it is helping us really show up for our time here on the planet. Sorry if that's a bit existential.
I don't think you're very far off of Deming's answer. And when I asked it, I was a young TV reporter at the time, and he was silent for a very long time.
Okay.
And then he just looked up and he said, "Joy." And then he walked away. I was like,
hey, I think I'm quite, I think, I said it in 300 words instead of 1, which is, I'm afraid that's my my personality. But apart from that, it's a great answer.
So let's go to this question from Anonymous. Danny Meyer, in our earlier session, which started off our day, who is, of course, tremendous, said that there are really only 2 kinds of problem solving: the ones for which you know the solution, but that there are unpleasant things to deal with, so you leave that aside. And there are the ones that you do not have a solution for, and so they need some deep thinking. Anonymous is asking you, how do you approach both of those, right? Okay, I got this problem. It's just so uncomfortable to do what needs to be done. I'm just going to not do it for a while. Or I got a problem and I don't know what to do. Thoughts, insights. We promised that this conversation would change our lives, so do that right now.
Let me say a sort of a broad thing about problems, and that is that I think that it's really crucial to distinguish between the difficulty of a problem itself and then this kind of discomfort that comes from having problems. There's a lovely Sam Harris, the podcaster, neuroscientist, tells this great story about one day when he was sort of moaning to a friend about all the problems in his work and how annoyed he was at having to face them. And she sort of interrupted him and said, like, hold on, are you still under the illusion that you're going to get to a point in your life when you don't have problems? Like, do you still think that's coming? Because it isn't, and we wouldn't actually want it to. I think if you think deeply about it. So I think it's that sort of accepting the state of having problems per se is pretty important. I'm afraid that when it comes to the specifics of the question that you passed along here, I am going to go back to tolerating discomfort. I'm going to say that, in the one case, it's a question of realizing that the modest discomfort of confronting the thing is almost certainly going to be less than the eventual discomfort of letting it fester. And in the other kind of problem, the sort of the willingness to patiently stay consciously in the situation of not having an answer, to talk about it with people, to research about it, to reflect on it without this kind of restless need to get it off your plate. This is what the poet John Keats called negative capability. I think it's such an amazing phrase. We need it in so many different contexts, right? The ability to be okay with something still being open and unsolved actually often leads you to a solution much more quickly.
Yeah, and may lead you to developing some of the muscles you needed to solve the problem in the first place.
Yeah.
Last couple of minutes here, and it really flew by, so I thank you for all of that. But we sometimes work for leaders who have a different sense of time than we do, and so this one person posing the question is saying, if you're reporting to a leader who you might be trying to kind of set some healthy priorities and boundaries and values and really get work done, but they are trying to drive a burnout culture. At least maybe that's not their intention, but they are. How can we lead up in terms of how we guard and work with time to be doing things in a productive way, in ways that maybe those above us don't quite see it the same way?
I think there are certainly plenty of sort of specific outward actions when it comes to communicating. Well, okay, you want me to prioritize this, what would you like me to deprioritize? And certain cultures are going to be more amenable to that kind of discussion than others. I think where it starts is with understanding that you don't have to take that on board in a deep way, even if you do have to exist with it, right? So even if you're in a culture where, your impossible demands are being made, the speed at which you're being driven is something that doesn't work for actually getting the work done in a good way, you may have to go along with certain aspects of that at certain points strategically because you want that job and you want that career path. You can sort of secede psychologically from it, right? You don't need to buy in to the idea that, yes, if I did just manage to work twice as efficiently and twice as hard for longer, then this would get us to where we need to be, that this would get me to a state of happiness and peace of mind. And what I've talked to people who've been in this situation, right, where you can't necessarily just change everything on a whim. You can find a kind of calm and sanity inside yourself, which comes from saying, okay, I'm in a crazy situation here. I'm still only going to be able to do what is possible, because you can't do what is impossible. The clue is in the name. And so that actually enables you to be a sort of calm center of the storm. You're still going, even if your boss wants you to do, 1,000 things in the day, you're still going to have to be making those choices, right? So all of this inner work is still useful for you because it enables you to be more resilient in that context. And then I think that very swiftly, the results that you deliver from that place are going to be very convincing.
Will speak
to many leaders. Yeah.
So two last things. So first one here, this wasn't posed as a question. It was posed as boredom is a valuable tool for health and creativity. Yeah. I know Neil Gaiman has talked about the power of boredom making himself bored, but speak a little bit to this idea of how we might incorporate the non-productive time, or that empty time where there is no set goal, there is no set agenda, and maybe even trying to intentionally make ourselves bored. Can that lead to a greater sense of productivity or efficiency or flow by making that, I dare to use the word, discipline to be bored?
I think it's really important to I never usually talk about it as being bored, although I think it does amount to the same thing, which is the sort of willingness to not be instrumentalizing one's time in a very clear way, right? The willingness to not be sort of asking, what is this leading to at every moment? We do this naturally. Dare I say, I think American culture does it even more than anywhere else on the planet, right? This idea that even leisure time has to be turned into things that have goals, things that have targets, things where you're really making the most use of your time. And the problem with this is that, yeah, I mean, it actually can crush creativity. It can lead to this kind of focus on restless action for action's sake. And apart from anything else, it's just not ultimately showing up for life, right? On some level, we do need to be willing to, quote, waste time, sort of being aimless in some sense, because otherwise all the creativity that is in us, in our unconscious, in conversations with people in an unplanned way, in our serendipitous encounters with ideas and people and places, none of that can happen to the extent that we're completely fixed on, like, are we using this time as well as possible? So yeah, doing nothing. I write in the book about a form of meditation that involves just literally doing nothing. It's basically impossible, but it's very good training to give it a go, because we are so conditioned to trying to do something, anything, with any moment of time.
Well, let me ask a huge question to end, but I'll try to do it in a way that it might not take much time to answer. So
I'll give a one-word answer if I can. Like,
oh yeah, right.
Deming.
So, in thinking about the themes and messages of your book, and I've seen reaction to this book in a bunch of interesting ways. Some people would say, I find this idea of this fleeting fragility of life, and it doesn't really matter in the end, as freeing. And then I can kind of go into this state of just kind of, let me go about the work I need to do and make things better in the world in some way. And that's freeing. Others have been a little more like, well, this kind of leads to a nihilism. Like, does it really matter at all? And we certainly are in a time where there's a lot of people asking those questions, and we certainly see it as a crisis in terms of mental health and around the world. And I've had recent conversations and done recent work with people like Arthur Brooks at Harvard and his happiness work, his new book with Oprah getting great reaction, and John Vervaeke at the University of Toronto and his work on the meaning crisis. You kind of have, and this is where I'm going to come to thing I've been wrestling with, but I think you're kind of in a good spot to give some final thoughts on this, which is we sometimes think of finding meaning, which is a big word. What is the point or the goal? Are we seeking happiness, or are we seeking meaning through challenge and responsibility? And if we happen into happiness, we sort of hit those moments with joy and gratefulness. Is it better to be seeking the hard thing and doing the process of making something difficult come to fore, or should we be seeking happiness as a goal in and of itself?
Can I give a third answer? Joseph Campbell, the scholar of myth, said that, I'll be paraphrasing, but he said that, everyone says that we're seeking the meaning of life or experience of meaning in life, but actually he thought that what we were seeking is a feeling of aliveness. What I like about that phrase is that it does return this idea of meaning to something very intuitive, right? Everyone has the experience of being in difficult, unpleasant situations that we would not have chosen, and yet understanding that they are deeply meaningful, that we're where we should be, that we're making a difference, that it matters that we spent that period of our time the way we did. And everyone certainly has experience of things that are sort of on some level pleasurable, but like obviously not meaningful. I think the challenge, the sort of way to argue back against the sort of nihilistic risk here, is to say, I hope that everyone here does things that change the world in extraordinary ways, but that is not the only definition of meaningful. We all know that reading to a child of ours is a meaningful thing to be doing. We all know that being in nature or helping in our community in very small ways that might not resonate down the centuries, we all know that matters. Meaning can exist in the moment, and it can exist, and you detect it through that feeling of rightness, which absolutely I think doesn't always go along with happiness in the shallowest sense of that term anyway.
Right. Well, I have so many other deep questions, but we're 4 minutes over the time that we had allotted for this. And when you have a time philosopher, you're like, I think I'm committing some grave, moral error by having it drifted past the allotted time. So, but we thank you very much for a great discussion, and hope to talk to you again about these things in the future, Oliver.
Thank you. It's been a huge pleasure. I really enjoyed it. Thank you, everybody.
Indeed, indeed. And so let me hold on. So I got to remove Oliver from the spotlight so then he can go about his day. And and I want to thank all of you for watching the open sessions that we've had. We've got one more important thing to get to here before we shut this part down. Note to our subscribers, we do have that if you're part of the Admired Leadership community and a subscriber to our platform, not just our field notes, but our actual Admired Leadership platform at admiredleadership.com, we are going to do at the top of the hour a bonus session with Randall Stepman, the founder of Admired Leadership. Very similar to the Q&As that we've done in the past on a regular 3-week cadence, but we'll go even a little bit deeper today on that. So stay tuned for that. You have a separate link in your email for that. But we've covered a lot of territory here, and some of you maybe have been recent subscribers to Field Notes, or you were invited to attend and watch today, and you're kind of thinking, gosh, these people are into some really deep and heady, but yet practical conversations about leadership. I'm kind of like that. Oh, great. You found your people. So how do you become part of this? How would you get more involved? I want to bring in my colleague, Wes Bender. He is an expert in talking about just these very things. So he's going to take a couple of minutes before we wrap things up. Wes.
Thanks, Scott, and appreciate the opportunity to build on the incredible conversations that we've been having with these great leaders. First off, I got a text from my son just a bit ago. He's listening in. Go ahead and say to your siblings, Jackson, that you've got a different way. They've got a different way to approach in saying, I'm bored. That no longer has negative connotation at our house anymore, thanks to the great conversation from Oliver. But I'm curious, of the hundreds of people that have logged in throughout the day today, how you would define a great leader. We've heard some great leaders all day today. How would you define that? If you scroll through your LinkedIn feed at any point in time in today's world, you'll get a million different definitions of leadership, a million different frameworks, rubrics, if you will. And in fact, if we were to walk into your organization, would everyone define leadership the same way? Would they say, hey, here are the leaders? In most organizations, in a best case scenario, you'll get 2 buckets of leaders that get grouped. If you were to ask everybody who are the great leaders here, who are the best leaders, you get a bucket of people who are high performers, whatever goals, whatever numbers they're being asked to perform on, they're knocking those out of the park. And you'd get maybe another bucket of leaders. These are leaders that we would call who create great followership. They build great relationships, great culture. People say, you know what, I love being around them. The research and the literature that's out there and been out there for a while says that there is actually a very small percentage of individuals who are knocking it out of the park at both performance and followership. This is a category of leader that we like to call an admired leader. People who are just knocking goals out of the park, and at the same time, people say, you know what, I love being around those people. Now, a lot of individuals know that admired leaders move the needle forward. They move the needle forward in numbers. They move the needle forward in relationships. They move the needle forward in teams and in their organization. They move that needle forward as admired leaders. People who truly understand that and want to get better at that. You heard Scott say, our kind of working definition of leadership is people who make people in situations better. They walk into a room and their influence, their behaviors, their routines, the things that they do make that a whole environment in that situation better at the end of the day. People who truly want to get better and know leadership will move the needle on that, they often do not focus solely, and in fact will get frustrated around things like complicated frameworks, psychometrics, silver bullets. They'll even get frustrated at times with things like leadership principles or paradigms or mindset shifts. What we know is at the end of the day, the leaders who truly understand what it means to get better ask one very simple question. What do the most admired leaders in the world do? And how can I implement those behaviors and routines into my daily rhythm of leadership? That's the question that they ask. I love Chad and Danny both seem to key in on this idea of trust your gut. And in fact, I love what Chad said when he was articulating his employees getting upset with him, asking, "What are you asking us for?" And Chad simply said, "Well, I've just been doing this a long time. It's hard for me to articulate." Past history would show that likely Chad, because of his experience, has kind of just fallen into some behaviors and routines that make him very, very good at what he does, and he can't even articulate what those are. Now, those behaviors and routines likely specific to his specific industry and the restaurant and the great work that he does. But Admired Leadership in the last 30 years has uncovered and researched universal behaviors and routines of leadership, basically saying across every industry, across every demographic, there's a common set of behaviors and routines that the most admired leaders in the world do, and they work universally across the board. This is the preeminent sandbox that we love to play in at Admired Leadership. Engage. How do you become a better leader? Engage in world-class practical content and have conversations and dialogue around that content. Content needs to be actionable, needs to be able to be something that you can implement immediately. And the conversation and dialogue around that content galvanizes it so it becomes part of who you are, becomes part of your very genuine leadership behaviors that you do, so it doesn't come across as technique. With just opportunity to tell everybody, you'll get some follow-up information from us in the coming days. We'd love for you to stay engaged with us and really be a part of this growing community of admired leaders working to be better each and every day. Scott, I'll turn it back over to you. Appreciate the time to add to the value of the conversation today.
All right, Wes, thank you very much. And thanks to all of you. You asked great questions and you were very attentive and very spirited in the chat. We appreciate all of that. And we will be back with another one of these next fall, and we'll have a lot of open sessions for everyone. And then for those of you who are part of our subscriber community, we'll see you at the top of the hour. But for everyone, have a great day. And we look forward to, well, you're going to read tomorrow's field note, aren't you? Of course you are. All right, have a great day.